In late November 1994, two friends are hiking in Palmer Park. It's the middle of the day, and nothing seems out of the ordinary.
Palmer Park is a wilderness park essentially located in the geographic center of the city. It's a large park, about 725 acres. It has a few paved roads that go through the park, a number of hiking trails, and there's one road that leads to the South Canyon of the park.
But when the hikers reach the South Canyon, they see something, anything but ordinary, lying on the ground. Just ahead of them is a body.
He was a white male, weighed over 300 pounds. He was fully clothed. He was lying on his back.
At first, it looked like the victim suffered an accident, possibly a heart attack. The hikers rush to notify the police. When detectives arrive at the scene, it becomes clear this was no accident.
The inspection of the body revealed that there was some obvious blunt force trauma to the head, as if he had been struck in the head with some type of an object, causing severe injury, in this case, his death. There were a number of rocks in the area, tree limbs and things of that nature, and any of these could have been a possible weapon.
The coroner places the time of death in the early afternoon, and he paints a grim picture of what may have happened.
The attack on Mr. Walton wouldn't have ended his life instantaneously. It would have taken multiple blows to different parts of the head as he continued to struggle. It would have been an exceptionally painful death.
The death is ruled suspicious, and Lt.Joe Kenda is called to the scene. Lieutenant Kenda heads up the Colorado Springs Major Crimes Division.
As I look at the victim's body, I'm trying to get a picture or a sense of what exactly is going on. This is a dirt area with a picnic table. There are a number of trails leading off from this area. There's no drag marks, there's no indication in that crime scene that he was moved from anywhere. There's no real indication of any struggle in the area of the crime scene. He is attacked where he stands and falls from where he's standing. My opinion, this kill happened exactly where he is.
Forensic investigators search the victim's clothes, but his pockets are empty. No wallet, no money. Robbery may be the motive, but to Kenda, the violence used in the kill seems extreme.
I'm always interested in the method. How do we kill this victim? Do we stand 50 feet away with a gun? Gun provides distance. It provides emotional distance. Don't get your hands dirty. Stand back and shoot. When it's a personal attack, and it's a vicious attack with multiple blows, and I'm sure that some of those blows were delivered when our man is on the ground. It tells you rage. Someone has a personal reason to kill this person.
As the scene is being processed, Lieutenant Kenda pays close attention to the boot prints found in the dirt.
I speak to my forensic investigators, and I realize we have lots of footprints all over the place, but I'm concerned about the ones around the body. Obese people have great difficulty engaging in physical fights. I don't expect there was much of one. So I want those footprints close to the remains. Maybe there's a stone lodged in a cleat. Maybe it's got a cut. Maybe it's got a wear mark where someone walks on their ankles or walks on their insteps. So wear patterns and damage to a print, as well as the pattern, can be significant if you can find a boot worn by a suspect that has those same unique kinds of characteristics. It comes close to a fingerprint in terms of identification.
Forensics also collected blood samples from around the victim's head to make certain that the blood was his and not someone else's. It's always a concern in a violent crime that perhaps the killer was injured as well.
Investigators create an ever-widening circle out from the victim's body, searching for more evidence.
One of the challenges to this case is to identify what really is the scope of your crime scene. Since this was a large park, it's possible that evidence could have been placed anywhere in a wide area.
Because it was out in the park, you didn't start with any clues as far as who might have been there. It could have been anybody in the world.
The search yields nothing. Whatever was used to kill the victim, most probably a rock, was nowhere to be found. And neither are any witnesses.
Nobody had any pertinent information, and so we were at a point where we didn't have any direct information leading to his cause of death or any information that might point us in the direction of any suspect.
But the search does turn up a clue leading to the victim's identity.
During the course of the preliminary investigation, they were able to account for everybody and every vehicle except for one van that was found. We did run the license plates on that van, and through that we were able to identify the victim in our case. That vehicle was registered to our victim, Robert Walton.
50-year-old Robert Walton. He's the deacon at a local church. But a religious leader? Pillar of the community? Who would want to kill this man?
When we first got the message, it was kind of, was really hard to tell exactly what happened outside of he had been killed. It's pretty hard to believe that it could happen. You hear these kinds of stories from time to time, but it really don't sink in until it happens to a family member or someone you're close to.
The news stuns members of the local community.
And here was somebody who on the surface seemed like somebody who was the all-American person who was attacked randomly in Palmer Park, which was a place where everybody felt safe in the community.
Dead bodies turning up in Palmer Park don't sit well with the public, especially if they've been murdered.
And you start thinking, well, wow, is that something where somebody's just walking along a trail and somebody comes up after them, behind them, or whatever, and attacks them? Is that something that, I should be concerned about next time I go to Palmer Park?
We've got to determine who he is. Who are you, Robert Walton? And what do you do with your time? And how did you create and derive an enemy that found you in Palmer Park that afternoon?
In his 23 years on the force, this case will prove to be one of Lieutenant Kenda's most difficult.
I was haunted by this killing. All we knew was that it was personal. Somebody wanted him dead, and I was going to find out why.
When 50-year-old church deacon Robert Walton is found murdered in Colorado Springs' largest park, investigators immediately contact his wife. They want to know if he had any enemies.
Mrs. Walton was in total shock when the officers told her that her husband was dead. She was even more distraught when they told her that he had been murdered. She found that to be completely unbelievable. She said her husband was a gentle person. He is admired by members of the church. He even offers counseling to members of the church.
You just wonder who would want to do that to somebody like him that was always so friendly, outgoing with people.
But if he was so well liked, why was he so brutally killed? Was it simply a robbery gone wrong?
There's always a possibility of a motive you haven't thought of yet, or a circumstance that you're not aware of. At the moment, we have only two. It's robbery, or it's personal. Could there be a third, fourth, and fifth? Of course, but we don't know enough yet to have an opinion about what that might be.
Robert Walton was born in Montana to a deeply religious family. In 1991, he and his wife moved to Colorado Springs, where he later became a deacon at Faith Alliance Church.
He started getting involved in church work and became a follower of the Lord. and devoted a lot of time and energy to his church.
We find Faith Alliance Church to be a legitimate Christian organization. People in it are devoted to their Christian faith. They speak very highly of Bob. Walton's co-workers tell us that he is a gentle person, wonderful man, friend to all, helpful to a fault.
Police also learned that Robert had a curious hobby.
Mr. Walton's friends said that he was knowledgeable about plants and called him Dr. Bob. They called him Dr. Bob for his ability to take sick plants and make them grow again.
It sounded like he really was just kind of a big, chubby teddy bear of a guy. Overall, you got the feeling that this was a guy who liked to be surrounded by other people. He was big into parties and celebrations and happy events as far as the church went, and wanted them to look nice and be nice and put a lot of energy into making that happen.
Everything about this individual says that he doesn't have an enemy in the world. Clearly not everybody loved Bob.
Robert Walton's friends tell police that he went to Palmer Park to collect greenery for a Christmas display at the church. That information doesn't jive with what Lieutenant Kenda saw at the crime scene.
There were none of those objects in, around, or near his body. So there was no evidence at the crime scene that he had done that. It's also possible that he didn't have time to do that. But there was no evidence of him collecting greenery at the park.
Investigators also learned that Walton was a marital counselor at the church.
When people seek counseling for things, it's an overwhelming problem to them. It's usually an emotional problem. And I am looking for some emotion in this. So that piqued my interest. Who might he be counseling?
Police learned one man sought out the deacon for something other than missing Sunday services.
We do a background check on this guy. He has a criminal past. He has assaulted people in the past. He has assaulted his wife in the past. So he has an assaultive personality. Well, I'm looking for one of those. We bring him in and talk to him. He tells us that he was angry with Mr. Walton because he didn't think Walton cared about his problem. Okay, now we have a guy who doesn't like Mr. Walton. He's the first one of those we've encountered. And he admits to all that up front. Says, look, I got a bad temper. I've hit people. I've done bad things in bars. I've hit my wife when I shouldn't have. But I have this sexual addiction, which he then describes in detail. Not embarrassed by it, not the least bit concerned about his sexual appetites. And that's why he wanted Walton to give him advice, so that he could stop behaving this way. And he wasn't happy with the result.
Kenda's looking for a motive, and he may have found it. But just because he doesn't like Walton doesn't mean he killed him.
This guy may have had a reason to be angry, but he was very truthful in the interview. I can spot a liar. Then this guy just wasn't one. There was no indication he had anything to do with Walton's murder.
Without any concrete evidence, the suspect can't be charged. Colorado Springs church deacon Robert Walton is found murdered in Palmer Park. Lieutenant Kenda decides to release certain details of the crime to the media, in the hopes that someone may have seen something unusual on the day of the murder.
The police department came to us and said, can you help us in the Robert Walton case? Can you put out some information asking the public to come forward and tell us what they know about Robert Walton or about the circumstances surrounding his death, or maybe they were in the park at the time and saw something.
The news generates a lucky break. A young couple recalls seeing a man in a large vehicle parked near where the victim was found.
They drew their attention to him because he looked like he was angry or upset about something. So that was at least a lead. This young couple was able to describe this person as a white male in his middle 30s, 5'10", 170 pounds, curly hair, and his facial expression disturbed them. He looked angry, looked upset.
The couple works with a sketch artist to create a composite drawing that's distributed to the local media. One caller points police in the direction of a local man named Jesse.
The caller said this guy goes to Palmer Park and hikes in the area. He looks like the composite drawing.
A background check reveals that Jesse is a laborer for a construction company. His ex-wife describes him as having a violent temper. Jesse is brought to the station for questioning.
He's belligerent, he's angry. How dare you think of me as doing this? He does look like that composite drawing. He does wear hiking boots. He spends a lot of time in Palmer Park.
Kenda knows that Palmer Park has a reputation for things other than hiking. So he decides to play a hunch.
We asked him what his sexual preference was, and he came unstuck. He was really angry that we asked him, informing us that you can't put that in a police report. I didn't know there were rules about what we can put in a police report, but he apparently thought so. We obviously touched a nerve, and it was the simple question, are you homosexual? Now, when you get that kind of reaction and denial, then my conclusion is, yes, he is. And he doesn't want anybody on the planet to know it.
But making the connection to Robert Walton is tenuous at best.
He can't really explain where he was that day, but the vibe I'm getting from this guy is he's not our guy. He doesn't know Robert Walton, and we can't connect him to Robert Walton. And even though he does look like that drawing, so do many other people.
The suspect is released for lack of evidence. But his reaction to Kenda's questions gives the veteran detective a new approach. Kenda refocuses the investigation not on who, but on why.
I don't believe he was there to collect things in Palmer Park. I don't think he was physically capable of doing that. He doesn't look to me like an athlete, or an experienced hiker, or even a walker. Why is he there? What's he doing in the middle of this park in the middle of the day?
Palmer Park has been linked with illicit homosexual activity. Could that be the reason for Walton's murder?
I don't think my brother was gay. I'd never seen any indication that he may be of that nature. I'd never heard anything that would indicate that, or I never saw anything that would indicate that. But I can't say yes or no.
The question is, did church deacon Robert Walton have a secret life?
Everyone has secrets that they don't want you to know, that they don't want to share. You never speak to anyone, ever, and get the truth. Parts of it, pieces of it, but it's always just a little out of focus.
Colorado Springs church deacon Robert Walton is found murdered in Palmer Park, and Lt.Joe Kenda has no motive or suspects. But a strange call from the coroner may change all that.
During the autopsy, when his clothing is removed, they find a washcloth that's been rolled and tucked, and that this is found in his crotch. It's a common technique in the homosexual world to put something in your pants to simulate male endowment.
This new information leads police to recontact Robert Walton's wife. Is there something she never told them?
Oftentimes we set up additional appointments because they have so much emotional trauma going on. It's difficult for them to really convey accurate, pertinent information for us, and so they need a few days oftentimes to kind of settle their thoughts and get back with us to give us information that we need.
Robert Walton's wife brings up two things that interest me in that conversation. The first thing she brings up is when they were living in Montana, she finds a homosexual men's magazine in her husband's underwear drawer. She thinks this is extremely unusual. So she asks him, where did this come from? He flies into a rage and says, somebody must have been playing an evil joke. And he destroys the magazine and says, we will never talk about this again. And they didn't.
The second thing that grabs Kenda's attention is that Mrs. Walton says her husband has been spending a lot of time away from home recently.
Mrs. Walton says her husband, the victim, had been disappearing, going places in the late afternoon, not being at work and not being at home. Mrs. Walton asked her husband, where have you been? Why aren't you home? You left work 2 hours ago. He would offer no explanation and finally said to her, don't ask me what I do with my time. That interested me as well. You have a secret. Now you're spending time away. What are you doing? At that point, we say, we suspect that your husband may have been involved in homosexual activity in the park. We get a strong reaction. She says, absolutely not true, that Mr. Walton is not homosexual. He has never exhibited anything in that way. We ask her about the washcloth in his pants. Her explanation is that he has a difficulty with accidental urination, and he often does this in his pants to prevent that from happening. Has he ever reported that condition to a doctor? I don't know.
His wife was quite concerned that one of the angles that had to be investigated was a possible homosexual angle. As with most wives, they never want to believe that their husband could have any proclivities in that direction. And whether or not he did was an open question. But it had to be investigated. In order to find answers, you have to look behind all the doors.
And one of those doors may be right in front of them at the park itself. Kenda's team sets up an undercover vice operation to lure their killer in.
There's a certain part of that park that's known to the homosexual community where you can meet someone new. It's commonly used as a cruising area for stranger-to-stranger homosexual sex.
That part of that park is the South Canyon. The South Canyon is where our crime scene was. So we ran an undercover operation with the park police to try to round up and apprehend as many people as we could. Not for engaging in homosexual activities, not against the law. I have no interest in homosexual activity in terms of the police. I'm looking for a killer. I'm not looking for a homosexual male. But my audience is potentially homosexual. Do they know who might have committed this crime? Have they heard anything in their community about this crime?
A number of arrests are made, but no one in the park has any information of value. Police turn their attention to local homosexual bars.
We take a photograph of Robert Walton with us. Does anybody know this man? Has he ever been in this establishment? Does he come to this club? No information whatsoever. At this point in this investigation, we're running out of places to go.
Police have run down every possible lead, and the homosexual angle may be a dead end.
We're not getting anywhere in the park. We're not getting anywhere in the homosexual community. We're not getting anywhere in the church. We can't find an enemy of Mr. Walton. We've talked to hundreds of people, and none of it's of any value.
When my brother was killed, and after a long period of time and nothing come up, and they kind of put it on the back burner, it seemed like, you know, you begin to wonder, and I kind of did lose hope for a little while.
It's frustrating. You've spent a lot of time and effort. You've dragged people in and out of a police station for a few days. Everybody's tired, nobody's slept. And now we gotta start over? Yeah, we gotta start over. Because we're not getting anywhere. So we begin again. What didn't we look into out of all this?
Lieutenant Kenda hasn't given up. He has his detectives redouble their efforts. They start with Robert Walton's past. Employment records indicate that several years before his murder, Robert Walton worked at a flower shop.
Robert Walton worked at Sunshine Florist. Sunshine, it was S-O-N, Shine, was a florist shop that catered to more of a Christian clientele. The Sunshine referred to the Jesus Christ, Son of God. So it was a place, I think, where Robert Walton felt comfortable because he was very active in his church.
Police talked to the owners and learned something strange. Walton did in fact work there, but he got fired when some money vanished from the safe.
When the money came up missing, there was no one charged at the time with the theft. There were people who had access to the money, and that included Robert Walton and others. But as far as what actually happened to the money, that question was never answered. One of the things we wondered at the time is whether or not Robert Walton had been involved with the theft in some way or knew who had, and that his killing was not random but was in some way related to the disappearance of that money.
Investigators then hear something equally bizarre. On the day of his murder, Robert Walton paid a visit to Sunshine Florist.
That interested me. What was he doing back in that flower shop on the day he was murdered? Was he there buying flowers? Or perhaps he was there to meet someone. Maybe that someone killed Robert Walton.
For nearly a year and a half, the investigation into the murder of Robert Walton goes nowhere. But investigators discover that the church deacon was suspected of stealing money from a flower shop where he once worked.
That robbery was never solved. As I understand it, nobody could really find a motive or had any idea of what might have happened or why it happened. My personal opinion is that it was something that may have stemmed back to the money that was stole at the flower shop.
If this is true, police may have been looking in the wrong place. Kenda runs background checks on all of Walton's co-workers at the time of the robbery. Turns out, one has a criminal record.
The fellow's name is Bryce Miller. Bryce Miller has a criminal record for assault. That's very convenient, Bryce, because I'm looking for a guy who lost his temper.
Kenda also finds out Bryce Miller drives a truck for work. Police know that two witnesses saw a suspicious white male, average height, mid-30s, driving a similar type vehicle.
It's a company vehicle, but it's his.
In Colorado Springs, historically, there are very few what we call stranger-stranger murders. And typically, the victim and suspect have some kind of relationship to each other.
The two once worked together, but detectives want to know if there's anything more to their relationship. So they pay a visit to Bryce Miller. The first thing they see on his porch puts a chill down Kenda's spine.
Right there in front of us on the porch is a pair of boots. The pattern on the sole is similar to the one collected at the crime scene, and they look to be about the right size. So, a little note in your head. We make contact with this guy. He denies even knowing Robert Walton, which is really odd. He worked with this guy in a small flower shop for 4 years, and you don't know his name? Oh, that Robert Walton. He's being evasive. He's being, I don't want to talk about this. I don't remember this guy. I don't know anything about this. And everything about him is saying, yeah, he does.
Soon, Bryce begins to change his tune.
Miller finally admits to knowing Walton, but said they weren't very close. Miller tries to change the subject by talking about his ex-wife.
As Miller is talking to us about his ex-wife, he mentions he's been having problems with his ex-wife, too. That word, too, immediately raises a red flag. Does that mean he's been having problems with Walton, too? Maybe. I'm thinking this guy has gone from not knowing Walton to now knowing him and having problems with him.
Kenda knows that Robert Walton kept secrets, so maybe Bryce Miller did too. Police bring Miller in for questioning. Lieutenant Kenda tries to make him uncomfortable. He starts by telling him that 2 witnesses have placed him in the park on the day of the murder. Miller admits that's true, but denies going there to meet the deacon.
We tell him we don't believe him. We tell him he's lying. We tell him obviously he is connected to Bob Walton. We tell him we think you're in Palmer Park that day. You meet Bob. You confront Bob. You beat Bob to death. Deny, deny, deny. But he denies it a little less fervently each time.
We didn't have evidence against Bryce Miller that could have supported a filing of a charge. When you have to prove something beyond a reasonable doubt, you need a lot more than just suspicions.
Investigators suspect that Walton's murder may have something to do with the money stolen from the florist, where they both worked.
The problem is we didn't have any physical evidence to tie Miller to the murder. So we needed some way to make him confess.
So now we're looking for a pressure technique. We know he has a daughter, young daughter. We know he's in a custody dispute in court because he wants that kid. Bryce, if you tell me what happened and it was an accident and you didn't mean it, it just sort of happened, well, that's second-degree murder. And you are young enough to where you might actually get out of prison. Maybe in time to see your daughter's wedding. But if I think you planned this and you enticed Bob Walton there so you could kill him, that's first-degree murder. And you are never going to see that child on her wedding day or any other time.
It's a year and a half into the Robert Walton murder investigation, and police have zeroed in on Bryce Miller as their prime suspect. But unless he's willing to admit to killing Walton, police don't have a case. So Kenda uses Miller's daughter as leverage.
He starts to cry, and then he uses that same expression. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. I didn't mean it. He just kept saying it. You didn't mean what, Bryce? He didn't mean what? When he starts to turn, when you know that, okay, he's come to grips with this, he knows he's trapped, and the next words out of his mouth are going to tell you about it. You can see it in his face. He's run out of excuses. He's run out of lies. He has the look of surrender. That's the moment when I sit back and say, I am talking to the right guy. In the Walton case, I've been looking for you for 17 months. And now here you sit. This is our guy. Bryce says he meets Bob Walton in that park by accident. He just runs across him. Bryce says that when they're talking, Bob Walton tries to sexually assault him. Bryce says, I think I'm going to be raped. Then Bryce says he picks up a rock or a stick, says he can't remember, and he hit Bob Walton in the head several times. And then he decides that Bob is probably dead. So he goes back to work.
Bryce has confessed to killing Walton, but says it was an accident.
He said that Robert Walton had approached Bryce Miller, and made a sexual overture toward him. Bryce Miller's version of events is that he tried to rebuff that advance, and Robert Walton kept insisting. What was interesting about it is that he never said Robert Walton got physical with him. So in the confession, it jumps from Robert Walton made a homosexual advance toward me and then wouldn't go away. And then he describes the scuffle between himself and Robert Walton. He says Robert Walton fell down and that he, Bryce Miller, fell underneath him. And he couldn't push him off.
But Kenda doesn't buy it.
The odds of Bryce Miller running across Bob Walton in the middle of this square-mile park have got to be 100 million to 1. But he insists he did. He insists that. I think that Miller and Walton knew each other. I think it's very possible they had an affair. They met there on purpose by prior arrangement.
Bryce says there's no connection to the money stolen from the flower store. The connection is sexual. Kenda's instinct all along.
He's arrested, taken to jail, and booked in for second-degree murder. Second-degree murder in Colorado is the knowing causing of a death, not premeditated. Premeditated is first-degree murder, which is, at that time, life in prison.
Bob's wife called and she was excited. She had just gotten word that they have arrested an individual and told us who it was. Finally, they're going to get justice here.
Investigators at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation Laboratory compare Miller's boots to the impressions found at the scene. They were determined to be of a similar size and type as those recovered. But because of the length of time between the murder and arrest, the boots could not be positively identified as having left the impressions at the scene. But the jury doesn't need the boots. They have the confession. Bryce Miller was found guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He will be eligible for parole in 2012.
At the end of the day, in almost all these cases, people say, why did this happen? What exactly happened? I don't know. The worst of it is you never do. Not for certain. I believe that Miller and Walton met each other in Palmer Park by prior arrangement. I further believe they'd been meeting there for some time. What I don't know is what was said and by whom to make this rise to an emotional level. That happened. When Miller says he was chased by Walton, I absolutely don't believe that. Walton wasn't physically capable of doing that. I think Miller attacked him and killed him right where he stood for whatever offensive thing he said or whatever offensive thing he might have done. But Miller was not acting in his own defense. He was attacking and killing his lover for reasons that only he knows.
You always wonder just what happened and why it happened. There's only two people that know what happened. One of them is gone, and we know what the other one has told us, but we're not sure that we have all of the details.
The end result was that Robert Walton was killed. He was killed by blows to the head and left in a park for...
The call came in just after midnight, a single ring slicing through the low hum of a New York winter night. And by the time patrol cars flooded the block, the city already sensed something had cracked open. Something ugly and irreversible, because on a quiet street where the windows were dark and the stoops were empty, a life had been violently interrupted and left behind like a question no one knew how to finish. The apartment door was ajar, not forced, not kicked in, just open enough to let the cold in, and inside the air smelled wrong, metallic and stale, the kind of smell that tells seasoned officers to slow their breathing and brace themselves. The victim lay where the living room met the kitchen, one shoe still on, the other missing, a detail so small it felt accidental, yet it would haunt the case for years, because nothing else in the apartment suggested a struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass, just silence, thick and deliberate, as if the room itself had agreed to keep a secret. Neighbors would later say they heard nothing, saw nothing, noticed nothing unusual, and in New York that answer is both ordinary and devastating, because in a city of millions, anonymity is a shield and a curse, and on that night in 2004, it wrapped itself tightly around this crime. The victim was young, known in the building, someone who nodded in elevators, borrowed sugar once, laughed too loudly on the phone, someone with plans scribbled into a calendar that now stopped abruptly on a date circled in red. Detectives moved through the apartment with practiced restraint, photographing every angle, bagging every object that felt even slightly out of place, a coffee mug in the sink, a jacket draped over a chair, a voicemail blinking unanswered on the phone. Each item was a potential headline waiting to happen, a strange clue, a last known contact, a breadcrumb that might lead somewhere, anywhere, other than back to this room. By dawn, the street was sealed with tape, blue and white against grey concrete, and word spread fast, faster than the official statements, faster than the facts. A murder, people whispered, a cold-blooded killing in a neighborhood that prided itself on being ordinary, safe, forgettable. The community felt the shock immediately, a collective intake of breath that lingered long after the sirens faded. News vans arrived, cameras hungry for angles, reporters rehearsing lines about a shocking crime, and an investigation just beginning, and somewhere in that noise, the truth began to blur, because the case offered no clear villain, no obvious motive, no neat narrative to cling to. Inside the precinct, detectives laid out the early facts like pieces from different puzzles, trying to see if any of them belonged together. The victim had no known enemies, no recent threats, no history that screamed danger. Friends described routines, habits, favorite takeout spots, a life mapped by predictability. Family members, shaken and sleepless, repeated the same questions, over and over. How could this happen? Who would do this? Why now? The autopsy confirmed what everyone already feared. The death was intentional, precise, and quick, suggesting someone who knew what they were doing, or someone who had nothing left to lose. Either possibility chilled the room. The investigation pushed outward, canvassing the block, the building, the nearby subway stations where grainy footage captured thousands of faces, but offered no clear answers. Detectives watched the tapes frame by frame, hoping for a glance held too long, a figure moving against the flow, anything that might separate one person from the blur of the city. Instead, they found the same thing again and again, motion without meaning. A man in a dark coat. A woman with a bag. A shadow passing out of frame. Each clip promised revelation, and delivered only frustration. As days turned into weeks, the case took on a name, a shorthand that stripped away the human cost, and replaced it with a label that sounded almost clinical. Cold case. The words landed hard, especially for those closest to the victim, because cold did not mean forgotten, not officially, but it did mean stalled, slowed, pushed aside by fresher crimes with clearer leads. Detectives still worked it, still chased tips, still followed up on calls from psychics and neighbors and strangers who swore they knew something, but the momentum was gone, replaced by a grinding persistence that felt less like progress and more like survival. Every few months, a new lead would surface, a former acquaintance, a co-worker with a grudge, a lover whose story didn't quite line up, and for a moment the case would heat up again, only to cool just as quickly when alibis checked out or evidence fell apart. Files thickened. Boxes filled. Names were underlined, circled, crossed out. The unanswered questions multiplied, and with them, the unease, because this was not a crime committed in the shadows of some distant alley, but in a home, a private space violated with chilling ease. The community tried to move on, but the case lingered like an unresolved chord. People locked their doors more carefully. Parents called their children more often. Conversations drifted back to that night, to what might have been missed, to who might have walked past without noticing anything at all. The victim's face became familiar in a way no one wants, reproduced on flyers, on news segments, on anniversary articles that asked, year after year, whether anyone had come forward, whether any progress had been made. Behind the scenes, detectives aged, retired, transferred, and the case changed hands, each new investigator inheriting not just the evidence, but the weight of failure that clung to it. Fresh eyes brought fresh theories, patterns others hadn't seen, connections drawn between timelines and phone records and financial statements that once seemed irrelevant. Yet every theory eventually ran into the same wall, a lack of proof strong enough to turn suspicion into certainty. The title that would one day be attached to this case, the one that promised resolution, still felt impossibly far away. In 2004, there was no sense of closure, no dramatic arrest, no press conference filled with relief. There was only a city that kept moving and a case that refused to be solved, its mystery deepening with every passing year. The apartment was cleaned, repainted, rented out again, but those who knew the story swore the place never felt the same, as if something had seeped into the walls and refused to leave. Even now, the earliest moments of that night replay in the minds of those who were there, the open door, the silence, the single shoe, details etched so deeply they became symbols of everything that didn't make sense. And somewhere in the vast sprawl of New York, amid millions of routines and secrets, the truth remained hidden, waiting, watching, as the case slipped further into history, carrying with it the uneasy feeling that the city itself was holding its breath, bracing for the moment when this mystery would finally, violently, break. The first real fracture in the case came quietly, not with a confession, or a siren-filled arrest, but with a detail that refused to settle, a thin thread tugging at the edges of the investigation, until someone finally pulled. It was the missing shoe. At first, it felt trivial, almost embarrassing to dwell on, the kind of thing detectives are trained to notice, but not obsess over, yet the longer the case dragged on, the more that absence began to glow like a warning light. One shoe on, one shoe gone. No signs of a struggle, no trail of blood leading out, no indication the victim had tried to run. So why was it missing? Did it leave with the killer, carried out unintentionally, or was it taken on purpose, a souvenir, a message, a mistake? Detectives retraced the victim's last known movements, hour by hour, minute by minute, building a timeline that felt solid in places and dangerously thin in others. A phone call earlier that evening, friendly, unremarkable. A short walk from the subway, captured briefly on camera, the victim's face visible for a second before dissolving back into the crowd. No one followed, no one approached. At least, no one obvious enough to stand out in footage already strained by time and technology. The city swallowed people whole in 2004, and it did so without apology. Inside the apartment, forensic teams revisited the scene again and again, their reports stacked high with technical language and cautious conclusions. Fingerprints were partial, smudged, inconclusive. DNA existed, but it was limited, degraded, not enough to point cleanly in one direction. It was the kind of evidence that promised answers in the future, not the present, a silent witness waiting for science to catch up. In the meantime, investigators were left with human stories, unreliable and emotional, shaped by fear, guilt, and the passage of time. Friends and acquaintances were interviewed repeatedly, their words recorded, compared, scrutinized for cracks. One friend mentioned an argument weeks earlier, nothing serious, nothing violent, but it went into the file anyway, underlined and highlighted, because in a case with no clear motive, even the smallest tension could be inflated into something sinister. A co-worker recalled seeing the victim distracted lately, checking over their shoulder, lowering their voice during phone calls. Another said that was just stress, nothing more. Memory became a battlefield, each recollection contested by another. Then there were the anonymous tips. They came in waves, often after news coverage spiked, voices on the line claiming to know the truth, to have overheard something, to have seen someone suspicious that night. Some tips contradicted each other. Others led detectives on long, exhausting detours that ended in dead ends. One caller insisted the killer was a stranger, a random act of violence by someone who vanished back into the city. Another swore it had to be someone close, someone trusted, because the door had been opened willingly. Both theories carried weight. Neither could be proven. As the months passed, the case began to harden into a shape investigators recognized all too well. No forced entry. No robbery. No obvious motive. A clean scene. It was the profile of a crime that could survive for decades without resolution, feeding on its own ambiguity. Detectives felt it in their bones, that creeping dread that this case was slipping beyond reach, becoming one of those files that future investigators would inherit with equal parts determination and resignation. The media, restless and unsatisfied, pushed for answers that didn't exist. Headlines shifted from shock to speculation, from community rattled to mystery deepens, and each article seemed to pull the story further away from the human life at its center. The victim became an image, a name, a symbol of unsolved violence in a city that prided itself on resilience. The family watched this transformation with quiet anguish, their private grief turned into public property, their questions echoed by strangers, who would move on to the next story as soon as it arrived. Behind closed doors, detectives argued. One theory gained traction, then fell apart. Another resurfaced, fueled by a new interpretation of old evidence. Was the killer someone from the victim's past, resurfacing unexpectedly? Or someone entirely unknown, drawn in by opportunity and chance? The missing shoe became a focal point again, debated endlessly. Some believed it suggested movement, a struggle that left no other mark. Others saw it as deliberate, a calculated act meant to confuse or taunt. Time did what it always does. Witnesses moved away. Memories faded. Details blurred. Phone numbers disconnected. Addresses changed. The city reshaped itself around the absence of answers, buildings renovated, businesses closed, new residents walking the same sidewalks unaware of what had happened there years before. The case file grew thicker, but clarity did not follow. Eventually, the investigation slowed to a crawl. Detectives still worked it, officially unsolved but never closed, a distinction that mattered deeply to those involved. Every so often, the case would resurface, triggered by a new technology, a reopened file, a fresh pair of eyes convinced they could see what others had missed. Each revival carried hope, and each disappointment cut deeper than the last. The victim's family marked anniversaries quietly, lighting candles, sharing stories, clinging to the belief that someone, somewhere, knew something they hadn't yet said out loud. They imagined the killer moving through the same city, riding the same trains, living an ordinary life shadowed by a secret that refused to die. That thought alone was enough to keep the case alive in their minds, even when official attention waned. Years passed. The phrase, New York 2004 murder mystery, became shorthand in precinct hallways, a case everyone recognized but no one had solved. New crimes demanded immediate action, fresh victims needed justice now, not later, and resources followed urgency. Still, the old file remained, waiting patiently, its unanswered questions stacking up like pressure behind a sealed door. And somewhere in that silence, the case continued to breathe, quiet but persistent, held together by unresolved details and the uneasy certainty that the truth had not vanished, only hidden itself, blending into the city's endless noise, waiting for the moment when something, anything, would finally force it back into the light. By the third year, the case had acquired a weight that went beyond paperwork, a heaviness that settled into the precinct like dust, impossible to ignore no matter how often it was pushed aside. New detectives were assigned, younger, sharper, armed with the confidence that comes from distance, convinced that fresh eyes could untangle what others had failed to see. They reopened boxes, replayed interviews, listened to old tapes where voices trembled with grief and suspicion, searching for inconsistencies buried beneath exhaustion and fear. What they found instead was something more unsettling, a pattern of near misses, moments where the truth seemed almost visible before dissolving again into ambiguity. One detail resurfaced with renewed urgency, a late-night phone call the victim had received just hours before death. At the time, it was dismissed as routine, a brief exchange that left no voicemail and raised no alarms. Now, years later, it felt different, heavier, especially when phone records revealed the number was prepaid, unregistered, and never used again. A burner phone, cheap and disposable, the kind favored by people who do not want to be found. Detectives leaned in, sensing the chill of intention behind the call, the possibility that this wasn't coincidence, but coordination. They traced what they could, hitting walls of outdated records and companies that had merged, dissolved, or purged data in the years since. Still, the idea stuck. Someone had reached out that night, someone who knew how to vanish. The door being opened suddenly made more sense. Perhaps the victim recognized the voice, trusted it, or at least didn't fear it enough to hesitate. That trust, if it existed, had been fatal. Another overlooked element crept back into focus, the building's security log. In 2004, technology was uneven, some systems digital, others stubbornly analog. The sign-in book for visitors was incomplete, names scrawled quickly, handwriting inconsistent, timestamps unreliable. For years, it was considered useless. Now, detectives studied it with fresh skepticism, comparing signatures, looking for anomalies. One name appeared twice that week, similar handwriting, different spellings. A coincidence, or an attempt to disguise repetition? The address listed was fake, the phone number disconnected. The name itself led nowhere, but its presence lingered like a smudge that wouldn't wipe clean. Interviews were reopened, and with them, old tensions flared. A former neighbor admitted, after years of silence, that they had heard voices that night, muffled but urgent, followed by a pause so sudden it had made their stomach drop. Why hadn't they reported it? Fear. Doubt. The belief that it was none of their business. In New York, minding your own business is a survival skill, and sometimes it costs more than anyone realizes. The statement added texture to the timeline, but still no faces, no names, no concrete proof. Detectives revisited the victim's personal life with sharper questions. Relationships were mapped and remapped, lines drawn between friends, co-workers, acquaintances, and strangers. One relationship in particular drew renewed scrutiny, a connection that had ended badly months before the murder. At the time, the former partner's alibi had seemed solid. Now, cracks appeared. Timelines overlapped too neatly. Phone pings placed them closer to the neighborhood than previously admitted. It wasn't enough to accuse, but it was enough to raise eyebrows, enough to reintroduce doubt. The missing shoe returned to the center of the conversation, now viewed through a different lens. If the victim had let someone in willingly, perhaps the shoe came off during a brief, contained struggle, one that never escalated into chaos. The absence of overturned furniture could suggest control, a confrontation that ended quickly and decisively. Or it could suggest something even colder, a scenario where the victim never had a chance to fight back at all. As theories multiplied, so did frustration. Every promising angle demanded resources the department struggled to justify for a case so old. Prosecutors wanted certainty, not speculation. They needed evidence that could survive a courtroom, not just convince a detective's gut. Without that, the case remained frozen in a state of perpetual investigation, active, but going nowhere. The media caught wind of the renewed interest and descended again, recycling old photos, old quotes, old questions. Is this the break everyone's been waiting for? They asked, their optimism thinly veiled hunger for resolution. Detectives said little, careful not to promise what they couldn't deliver. The family, hopeful but guarded, had learned the cost of believing too early. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Cold cases are patient, but they are also unforgiving. Every year that passed made witnesses harder to find, memories less reliable, evidence more fragile. The sense that time itself was working against them sharpened every decision. Miss one detail, chase the wrong lead, and another year could vanish without progress. Late nights at the precinct blurred together, coffee cups stacking up beside folders marked with dates that felt impossibly distant. Detectives argued over interpretations, over whether intuition should be trusted when facts were scarce. Some believed the case hinged on one person who had been overlooked, someone who blended in perfectly. Others believed the answer lay in plain sight, buried under assumptions made too early, too confidently. And through it all, the city outside continued its relentless motion, indifferent to the quiet desperation unfolding in fluorescent-lit rooms. Trains ran. Streets filled. Lives moved forward. Only the case stood still, suspended between what was known and what refused to be proven, its mystery deepening with every unanswered question, its shadow stretching longer as investigators edged closer to a truth that still refused to show its face. The fourth year marked a shift that no one announced out loud, but everyone felt, a subtle change in posture, in tone, in the way detectives spoke about the case when they thought no one else was listening. This was no longer just an unsolved murder, it was becoming a presence, something that followed them home, lingered in quiet moments, resurfaced in dreams. The evidence hadn't changed, but their relationship to it had. Every detail felt heavier now, weighted by the knowledge of how much time had already been lost. A single piece of physical evidence, long overlooked, was pulled from storage and placed back on the table under harsh white light. Fibers. Dark, synthetic, almost invisible against the apartment carpet, collected during the original sweep and logged without much enthusiasm. In 2004, they meant little. Years later, advances in forensic databases gave them new potential. Analysts compared them against updated samples, running tests that hadn't existed when the case began. The results were frustratingly close to meaningful. The fibers matched a common material used in coats sold across the city that year. Not rare enough to identify a suspect, but not meaningless either. It suggested proximity. It suggested contact. Detectives followed that thread into retail records, distribution chains, trying to narrow down where such coats had been sold, who might have owned one. The effort bordered on absurd, thousands of purchases, thousands of potential wearers, a reminder that data without context can drown an investigation just as easily as a lack of evidence. Still, the fibers stayed in the file, upgraded from footnote to question mark. Another crack appeared in a witness statement that had been considered reliable for years. A building resident, interviewed repeatedly, had insisted they were out of town the night of the murder. Travel records supported it, or so it seemed. A re-examination revealed something subtle but significant, the departure time. They left the next morning, not the night before. It didn't make them a suspect, not directly, but it reframed their certainty, their insistence that they couldn't have heard or seen anything. Memory, it turned out, had edited reality into something easier to live with. This realization sent a ripple through the case. How many other memories had shifted over time, reshaped by repetition, by fear, by the desire to be uninvolved? Detectives returned to transcripts with a new skepticism, reading not just what was said, but how it was said, noting pauses, changes in language, the subtle drift of stories told too many times. Inconsistencies emerged, not dramatic enough to make headlines, but enough to erode trust in the narrative everyone had accepted. The former partner, once a background figure, crept closer to the center of the investigation. Their life had unraveled in the years since the murder, relationships strained, jobs lost, a pattern of instability that raised uncomfortable questions. Friends described sudden mood swings, a fixation on perceived betrayals, a tendency to hold grudges long after others had moved on. None of it proved anything. All of it added color to a picture detectives couldn't ignore. They brought the former partner back in for another interview, this time with a different tone, less sympathetic, more precise. The questions came fast, layered, designed to disrupt rehearsed answers. Small contradictions surfaced. Times shifted by minutes, then hours. Places blurred. Sweat beaded. Still, nothing definitive emerged. The interview ended the way so many others had, with a sense of almost, a feeling that the truth had hovered just out of reach before retreating again. Outside the precinct, the case's reputation grew. It was mentioned in criminology classes, discussed in online forums where amateur sleuths dissected every available detail, sometimes uncovering angles professionals had missed, other times drowning the case in speculation. The internet gave the mystery a second life, one fueled by obsession and conjecture. Detectives monitored these discussions quietly, aware that buried among the noise could be a real lead, a perspective untainted by years of institutional thinking. One post caught attention. Anonymous, detailed, oddly restrained. It didn't accuse anyone outright. It simply asked a question about the missing shoe, suggesting it wasn't taken from the apartment at all, but removed earlier, somewhere else, and never put back on. The idea was unsettling. If true, it meant the timeline everyone relied on was wrong, that something critical had happened before the victim ever reached home. Detectives traced the post to a public computer, a dead end, but the theory lodged itself in their minds, reshaping how they viewed the final hours. Reconstructing that night became an exercise in controlled imagination. Where else had the victim been? Who else had they met? What moments went unrecorded, unseen, unremembered? Subway rides offered anonymity. Bars offered noise and distraction. Streets offered shadows. The city provided endless opportunities for a critical encounter to slip through unnoticed. As pressure mounted, so did the fear of getting it wrong. An arrest without ironclad evidence would be worse than no arrest at all, collapsing the case entirely, locking the truth away behind a verdict that couldn't be undone. Prosecutors reminded detectives of this constantly, urging patience, caution, restraint. The words felt heavy, almost cruel, to those who carried the faces of the victim and their family in their heads every day. Another anniversary passed. Candles flickered on a sidewalk now crowded with people who barely remembered why they were there. Speeches were short. Tears were quiet. Hope had thinned, stretched by time, but it hadn't disappeared. It lingered in the stubborn belief that the city, for all its noise and indifference, still held the answer somewhere within it. Inside a storage room filled with old cases, the box marked with the year and the victim's name sat exactly where it always had. Not closed. Not solved. Waiting. And as detectives locked up for the night, the feeling followed them out into the dark, the sense that the case was changing, slowly, imperceptibly, drawing closer to something dangerous, something definitive, even as it continued to resist the final, shattering clarity everyone feared and needed in equal measure. The fifth year arrived without ceremony, and with it came a quiet realization that unsettled everyone still attached to the case. The mystery was no longer just about what happened that night, but about why it had been allowed to fade so easily into the background noise of the city. Files were no longer kept on desks, but on shelves, pulled down only when a lead surfaced, or an anniversary demanded attention. Yet even in this slower rhythm, the case refused to die. It pulsed faintly, stubbornly, like a heartbeat beneath layers of neglect. A routine audit of evidence storage triggered the next shift. Boxes were opened, seals checked, inventories matched against logs written in different handwriting from different eras. In one box, beneath lab reports and photographs, a small envelope caught a detective's eye. Inside was a scrap of paper, barely larger than a matchbook cover, logged years earlier and promptly forgotten. It contained a partial note, a few words torn from something longer, written in hurried ink. At the time, it had been dismissed as meaningless, possibly trash picked up accidentally during the scene sweep. Now, reading it again, the phrasing felt deliberate. Not poetic. Not emotional. Functional. As if it were part of an instruction. Forensic analysis revealed nothing new about the ink or paper, but the words themselves sparked debate. Were they connected to the victim? Or to someone else entirely? Detectives searched the apartment photos again, zooming in on desks, drawers, trash bins, looking for the missing half of the message. They found nothing. If the note had once been whole, the rest was gone, taken or destroyed by someone who understood its value. That understanding raised a disturbing possibility. What if the killer hadn't panicked? What if they'd planned, adjusted, corrected mistakes in real time? The clean scene, once attributed to luck or coincidence, now hinted at something more methodical. This wasn't the chaos of rage or impulse. This felt controlled. Measured. That realization tightened the air in every meeting where the case was discussed. Attention shifted outward again, toward patterns beyond the victim's immediate circle. Analysts reviewed other unsolved cases from the same period, searching for echoes. Similar scenes. Similar restraint. Similar absence of obvious motive. New York had no shortage of violence, but certain crimes whispered to each other across time, linked by subtle consistencies only visible when viewed together. A handful of cases stood out. None could be officially connected, but the similarities were enough to unsettle seasoned investigators. The idea of a broader pattern was intoxicating and terrifying. If true, it meant the killer might not be a ghost who struck once and vanished, but someone who moved through the city repeatedly, refining their approach, learning from each encounter. The thought reframed everything. This wasn't just about justice for one victim anymore. It was about what might still be unfolding unnoticed. Yet evidence refused to cooperate. No shared DNA. No shared witnesses. No shared locations that could withstand scrutiny. The pattern remained theoretical, a shadow cast by coincidence and desperation. Still, it changed how detectives spoke about the case, their language more cautious, their questions sharper, their assumptions fewer. The victim's family sensed the shift even without being told. Meetings with investigators grew more intense, less comforting. Hope was no longer framed as closure, but as truth, whatever shape it took. They asked harder questions now. Why hadn't certain leads been pursued earlier? Why had some witnesses never been re-interviewed? The answers were never satisfying. Resources. Priorities. Time. Words that sounded hollow against years of unanswered grief. Then came a tip that didn't fit the usual mold. It wasn't anonymous. It wasn't dramatic. It was measured, almost reluctant. A former co-worker reached out, someone who had stayed silent for years, because they believed what they knew was irrelevant. They spoke of a conversation overheard months before the murder, a comment made in passing about being watched, about feeling uneasy in familiar spaces. At the time, it had been laughed off. Now, it landed differently. The co-worker couldn't offer names or specifics, just a feeling that the victim had been carrying something heavy, something they hadn't fully shared. Detectives pressed gently, knowing too well how easily suggestion could distort memory. Still, the statement reopened a line of inquiry that had gone cold early on, the possibility that the victim had sensed danger long before that night. Personal journals were re-examined. Emails reread. Old computers powered on again, their whirring fans sounding almost intrusive in the quiet room. Digital footprints from 2004 were sparse, but not non-existent. Deleted messages left traces. Calendars hinted at meetings that never happened. One entry, vague but persistent, appeared repeatedly in the weeks leading up to the murder. No name. No location. Just a time. Speculation followed, inevitable and corrosive. Was it a rendezvous? A confrontation? Something the victim dreaded but felt compelled to face. Without corroboration, it remained just another unanswered question, but it altered the emotional shape of the case, shifting it from sudden tragedy to slow-burn menace. As winter settled in again, detectives found themselves circling familiar ground with unfamiliar eyes. The building. The street. The subway entrance. Each place felt altered by context, layered with meanings accumulated over years of scrutiny. They stood where the victim had stood, looked where they might have looked, trying to inhabit a moment that refused to be fully reconstructed. Public interest waned and surged in cycles, driven by anniversaries and rumor. Each surge brought new theories, new accusations, new pain for those already exhausted. Detectives learned to filter the noise, to listen without being pulled under by it. Somewhere, buried in repetition and speculation, they believed there was still a signal waiting to be isolated. Late one night, reviewing transcripts yet again, a detective noticed a phrasing used by two different witnesses years apart. The same uncommon expression. The same odd emphasis. It could mean nothing. Or it could mean influence, stories bleeding into each other over time. Or it could mean something far more unsettling, a shared source. The idea lingered, unproven but potent, threading through the case like a low electrical hum. Someone had shaped the narrative early on. Someone had steered attention away from certain details, whether intentionally or not. The possibility reframed the entire investigation, turning the spotlight not just on what had been said, but on how and when it had been said. As the fifth year closed, the case stood at an uneasy crossroads. It had more questions than ever, but also a sharper sense of what those questions should be. The mystery had matured, hardened by time, resistant to easy answers. And in that resistance was a warning: whatever truth lay at the center of this case was not simple, not accidental, and not done leaving its mark on everyone who came too close. By the sixth year, the case had developed a strange dual life, one inside the precinct and one beyond it, in the minds of people who had never known the victim, but felt pulled into the gravity of the story. Online forums buzzed with theories, timelines reconstructed by strangers who spoke with unsettling certainty, names floated and dismissed with a click. Detectives watched this from a distance, wary of contamination, but aware that sometimes, pressure from the outside forced movement where bureaucracy stalled. The line between help and harm blurred, and the case existed uncomfortably in both worlds at once. Inside the department, a quiet decision was made to consolidate everything, to strip the case down and rebuild it from the ground up. No assumptions. No inherited conclusions. Just facts, arranged in order, however uncomfortable that order might be. It was a painful process. Some long-held beliefs collapsed immediately. Others refused to fit unless something essential was missing. That absence, that negative space, became as important as any physical clue. The burner phone returned to the forefront, no longer treated as an isolated oddity, but as a pivot point. Analysts re-examined call patterns, not just to and from the victim, but within the surrounding hours in the same cell tower range. Patterns emerged, faint but suggestive. Several numbers appeared together in clusters, briefly active, then gone forever. It hinted at coordination, at people moving in parallel, communicating just enough to get what they needed and then dissolving back into anonymity. One number in particular stood out. It never contacted the victim directly, but it hovered nearby, calling and being called by other burner phones in tight windows of time. Its movements, traced through cell tower data, mirrored the victim's path that night with unsettling precision. It wasn't proof. It was proximity. And in a case starved for certainty, proximity was oxygen. Detectives pushed for more, digging into records that had long been considered irretrievable. Subpoenas were issued again, this time with sharper focus, narrower demands. The returns were thin, but not empty. A payment record surfaced, cash used to activate a phone at a convenience store blocks from the victim's apartment. The footage from that store was gone, erased years earlier, but the location itself became significant, anchoring the theory to a physical point in the city. They walked that block again, noting sightlines, traffic flow, places someone could wait without being noticed. The city had changed, but the geometry hadn't. The thought that the killer might have stood there, blending into the everyday flow of people, tightened every jaw. This wasn't a crime committed in isolation. It was woven into the fabric of the city, hidden in plain sight. Attention turned to the idea of accomplices, a possibility that explained too many loose ends to ignore. One person to make the call. Another to watch. Another to ensure the door opened. The theory was dangerous, because it multiplied unknowns, but it also aligned with the evidence that refused to point to a single, simple culprit. If true, it meant silence had been maintained not by chance, but by mutual interest, by shared risk. The victim's routines were scrutinized again, this time not for what was unusual, but for what was predictable. The same train. The same route. The same times. Predictability, detectives realized, is a vulnerability. Someone who watched long enough could have planned everything down to the minute. The realization reframed earlier statements about feeling watched, about unease that had been dismissed as stress. Perhaps it hadn't been paranoia at all. A former acquaintance resurfaced during this phase, someone loosely connected to both the victim and the building. They had never been a focus before, too peripheral, too forgettable. Now, when their name appeared in phone records adjacent to one of the burner numbers, the coincidence felt heavy. The connection was indirect, deniable, but it existed. Interviews followed, cautious and polite, designed to reveal patterns rather than provoke defensiveness. The acquaintance denied everything with calm confidence, their story smooth, almost too smooth, practiced over years of telling it to themselves. They placed themselves elsewhere that night, with people who no longer lived in the city, in locations that no longer existed. Verifying the alibi was difficult, but not impossible. Bits checked out. Others remained frustratingly ambiguous. The missing shoe surfaced again, this time as a symbol rather than a clue. If there were accomplices, if there had been movement before the apartment, then the shoe might mark the moment control was lost, when the situation shifted from observation to action. It suggested a threshold, a point of no return that investigators still couldn't place on a map. Internally, tension rose. Some detectives felt the case was finally aligning, its scattered pieces snapping into something coherent. Others worried they were building castles out of coincidence, that the desire for resolution was shaping the narrative more than the facts. Arguments flared, then cooled. Everyone understood what was at stake. Get it wrong, and the case would collapse under its own weight. Outside, the family waited, reading between the lines of careful updates, sensing when hope was being rationed. They had learned to live with uncertainty, but that didn't make it easier. Each new theory reopened old wounds, forcing them to imagine the final hours again, through new, more disturbing lenses. As the 6th year drew to a close, the case stood on a knife edge. It had never been this complex, this layered, this close to something that felt like truth. And yet, the closer investigators seemed to get, the more dangerous the silence around the case became, thick with the possibility that someone, somewhere, was paying attention, aware that the walls were starting to move in, aware that a story long buried was beginning to shift, and might soon demand to be told whether anyone was ready or not. The 7th year cracked open, with a sense of unease that no briefing could explain, a feeling that the case was no longer just being studied, but quietly resisted. Leads that once trickled in slowed to nothing. Phones went unanswered. People who had been cooperative before suddenly became unreachable, as if an unspoken signal had gone out, warning that silence was safer than memory. Detectives noticed it immediately. So did the family. Absence, in this case, spoke loudly. A meeting was held behind closed doors, the kind where voices stay low and words are chosen carefully. The question on the table was no longer who did it, but who knew more than they were saying, and why they were still protecting that knowledge after all this time. The possibility that fear, not loyalty, was driving the silence reshaped everything. Fear doesn't fade easily. It calcifies. Investigators returned to the burner phone cluster with renewed urgency, mapping movements against the city's rhythms. Late-night maintenance schedules. Train delays. Construction closures. Anything that could explain why certain paths were taken, why certain calls lined up so precisely with moments when the victim was most vulnerable. The data suggested planning, not improvisation. Someone had anticipated the city's chaos and used it as cover. Then, without warning, a break arrived in the most unglamorous form imaginable. A routine database update flagged a match that hadn't existed before. Not a name. Not a face. A pattern. One of the burner numbers shared a purchasing behavior consistent with a known alias used in an unrelated fraud case years later. The link was tenuous, circumstantial, but it was real. For the first time, the case brushed against another crime with a documented trail. Detectives moved carefully, aware that overconfidence had sunk other investigations before. They followed the alias through financial records, rental agreements, short-term leases paid in cash. The person behind it moved often, left little behind, and favored anonymity. When they surfaced in interviews tied to the fraud case, they presented as charming, forgettable, the kind of person no one remembers clearly. That forgettability now felt deliberate. The alias led to a real name, then to another, then another still. Each identity peeled away revealed a life built on distance and misdirection. None of the names appeared in the original case file. That omission felt significant. This was someone who had slipped past the initial perimeter of suspicion entirely, not because they were invisible, but because no one had known to look. Surveillance footage from years after the murder showed this person moving through the same neighborhood, older now, heavier, but unmistakably familiar once the connection was made. It raised a question that tightened every throat in the room: why come back? Nostalgia seemed unlikely. Convenience, maybe. Or confidence. The belief that whatever had happened in 2004 was buried deep enough to stay there. An attempt was made to bring them in quietly, unofficially, under the guise of questioning related to the fraud case. The interview was short, polite, and deeply unsettling. They answered questions easily, volunteered information that wasn't asked for, and deflected anything that edged too close to New York in 2004 with practiced humor. No panic. No anger. Just control. When the interview ended, nothing concrete had been gained, but the room felt colder than before. Meanwhile, a former witness reached out unexpectedly, their voice shaking, their request urgent. They didn't want to be named. They didn't want protection. They just wanted something off their chest. They spoke of a conversation overheard years ago, between people they didn't know well, referencing that night, and how close it got. At the time, it meant nothing. Now, it sounded like a confession spoken sideways, coded but unmistakable. Details were scarce. Dates fuzzy. Names missing. But the emotional weight of the core was undeniable. This wasn't attention-seeking. This was guilt leaking out after years of pressure. Detectives logged the statement, cross-referenced it with timelines, locations, known associates. The web tightened, strand by strand, though it still refused to close. Inside the precinct, caution gave way to urgency. The sense that the case was entering a dangerous phase grew stronger by the day. Not dangerous in the streets, but dangerous in the courtroom, where weak links could be exploited, narratives dismantled, years of work undone by a single misstep. Prosecutors were briefed, skeptical but attentive. They asked the hardest question of all, can you prove it? The answer, still, was no. Not yet. The family was told only that progress was being made, that the case was active, that silence didn't mean stagnation. They nodded, grateful and wary, having learned that words like progress could mean many things and promise nothing. As the year pressed on, detectives found themselves haunted not by what they knew, but by what the suspect knew. Someone out there understood the case intimately enough to stay ahead of it, to adjust, to disappear when necessary. That awareness shifted the balance. The investigation was no longer one-sided. It was a quiet contest of patience and nerve. And in that contest, the city remained the ultimate accomplice, offering endless places to hide, endless noise to blend into, endless time to wait. But time, investigators knew, cuts both ways. Memories fade. Evidence degrades. But patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. And as Part 7 drew to a close, the pattern was clearer than it had ever been, even as the truth at its center remained just out of reach, watching, silent, and dangerously calm. The 8th year arrived with a pressure that felt almost physical, as if the case itself had begun to push back, testing how far it could be pursued before something broke. The alias was now a constant presence in briefings, written and rewritten on whiteboards, connected by lines that grew thicker with every new discovery. Still, no one said the word suspect out loud. Not yet. The difference between suspicion and accusation was a chasm, and everyone knew how easy it was to fall into it too soon. A deeper dive into the alias's past revealed a trail that stretched far beyond New York, touching other cities, other lives, all marked by the same habits. Short stays. Cash payments. Jobs that ended abruptly. Relationships that dissolved without explanation. It was a life designed to leave no anchor, no fixed point that could be easily revisited. Detectives began to understand that whoever this person was, they were practiced at vanishing, at stepping sideways just as attention sharpened. The question that refused to go away was motive. Fraud explained some of the behavior, but not the violence. Something had escalated in 2004, something that pushed this individual, or this group, beyond deception, and into something irreversible. Investigators revisited the victim's finances with this in mind, looking not for large thefts, but for small irregularities, minor transactions that could signal a deeper entanglement. They found a handful of unexplained withdrawals, modest amounts, easily overlooked. Too small to raise alarms. Too consistent to ignore. Those withdrawals lined up with dates tied to the mysterious calendar entries, the ones marked only by time. It suggested meetings, quiet exchanges that left no obvious trace. If money had changed hands, then trust had existed, at least briefly. Trust that had ended badly. The realization reframed the victim not just as a target, but as a participant in something they may not have fully understood, or believed they could control. Detectives tread carefully here. Victims are often posthumously blamed when cases grow complicated, and no one wanted to fall into that trap. Still, the evidence demanded honesty. The victim's life, once described as predictable and uncomplicated, now appeared layered, touched by risks kept deliberately out of view. The gap between the public image and the private reality widened, and within that gap, the motive might be hiding. A breakthrough nearly collapsed under its own weight when analysts discovered a partial DNA profile linked to the alias through an unrelated arrest years later. The match wasn't clean enough to make an arrest. It was degraded, incomplete, a whisper rather than a shout. But it was enough to send a shock through the room. For the first time, biology touched the case, bridging years with something undeniable, even if it couldn't yet be weaponized in court. Legal teams were brought in early, their caution palpable. They warned detectives not to rush, not to overstate what the science could prove. A weak DNA argument could poison everything else. The case needed to be airtight, or not at all. The advice was sound, infuriating, and necessary. Meanwhile, the alias noticed. Or at least, investigators believed they did. Movements changed. Patterns shifted. The person moved again, this time more abruptly than before. Utilities were shut off. Leases abandoned. It felt reactive, as if pressure applied in one place caused movement in another. Surveillance teams tried to keep pace, always a step behind, always careful not to reveal how much they knew. The family sensed the tension in every update. Investigators spoke in careful language, avoiding details, but the strain showed. This was no longer a cold case warmed by curiosity. It was active, volatile, alive. Hope flared, bright and dangerous. After years of waiting, the possibility of an answer felt both intoxicating and terrifying. What if the truth, when it came, was unbearable? Another witness surfaced, during this period, drawn out by the renewed attention, and the quiet rumors that something was finally happening. This one had a name, a face, a history tied loosely to the alias. They spoke of late-night conversations, of paranoia, of someone obsessed with being recognized, with being seen and not seen at the same time. They described a person who planned relentlessly, who rehearsed outcomes, who hated unpredictability. The portrait aligned too well to dismiss. Cross-checking the witness's account against known movements tightened the net further. Dates matched. Cities aligned. Gaps closed. Still, no confession, no weapon, no definitive moment that could be pointed to and labeled as the turning point. The case advanced in increments so small they were almost invisible, progress measured not in miles but in inches. Behind the scenes, frustration threatened to fracture the team. Years of investment had created emotional stakes that were hard to suppress. Younger detectives urged boldness. Veterans urged restraint. Everyone knew that one wrong move could undo everything. The alias, now more than a theory but less than a defendant, sat at the center of it all, untouchable and increasingly aware. As winter settled over the city again, detectives returned to the original apartment, now renovated beyond recognition. New paint. New fixtures. New lives. Standing there, it was hard to reconcile the sterile present with the violence of the past. And yet, the walls had not forgotten. Neither had the case. The missing shoe, the open door, the burner phone, the cash withdrawals, the aliases, the partial DNA, the whispered conversations, they all pointed in the same direction now, converging toward a truth that felt imminent but fragile. One solid piece could shatter the silence. One mistake could seal it forever. And so the investigation pressed on, quieter than ever, heavier than ever, moving forward with the careful inevitability of something that had waited 8 long years to be understood, knowing that when the final piece fell into place, it would not just answer a question, but change the story of that night, and everyone connected to it, forever. The 9th year began with a sense of narrowing, as if the vast sprawl of uncertainty that once defined the case had compressed into something tighter, sharper, more dangerous. The alias was no longer just a shadow drifting at the edge of the investigation. It had weight now, mass, a gravity that pulled every remaining question toward it. Yet that gravity brought risk. The closer detectives moved, the more they felt the fragile balance between revelation and collapse. A decision was made to step back before moving forward again, to test the case the way a defense attorney would. Every assumption was challenged. Every inference attacked. If this went to court, what would survive? What would crumble under cross-examination? The answers were sobering. Much of what felt compelling in the quiet of the precinct could dissolve under bright lights and hostile questions. The case needed something undeniable. Something that didn't rely on interpretation. That something, investigators believed, might still be hiding in plain sight. They returned to the victim's digital life, not with the tools of the past, but with modern recovery techniques that treated deleted data not as absence, but as residue. Old hard drives were examined again, sectors scanned for fragments, timestamps analyzed with obsessive care. What emerged was not a full message, not a clear confession, but a ghost of communication, partial text strings that suggested coordination, meetings arranged obliquely, language designed to be meaningless to anyone else. One fragment repeated across different platforms, different dates. A phrase that could be dismissed as casual, even affectionate, but now read as procedural, coded. It wasn't proof of a crime. It was proof of a relationship that hadn't been fully understood. And relationships, detectives knew, were where motives lived. The phrase was traced outward, searched against databases, forums, archived emails scraped from corners of the internet few people remembered anymore. It surfaced once, years later, in an unrelated investigation, used by someone operating under yet another alias. The connection was thin, almost laughably so, but it existed. And in a case like this, existence was everything. Surveillance intensified, though quietly, carefully, aware that any obvious move could send the alias underground for good. The person's routines were erratic, but not random. There were patterns in the chaos, habits that betrayed comfort zones. A favorite late-night diner. A stretch of river walked too often. A preference for certain neighborhoods where anonymity was thickest. Detectives followed without following, watching reflections rather than faces, learning rhythms without interrupting them. Then came the moment that felt like a mistake even as it happened. A minor traffic stop, unrelated to the case, flagged the alias's current identity. Nothing illegal. Nothing dramatic. But the interaction was logged. A uniformed officer, unaware of the broader context, had spoken to them, looked them in the eye, recorded the encounter. When detectives learned of it, the room went silent. The alias now knew, or at least suspected, that they were visible. The reaction was immediate. Movement increased. Phones went dark. A storage unit was cleared out overnight. Whatever sense of comfort the alias had been operating under evaporated, replaced by urgency. It confirmed what investigators already feared. This was someone who understood risk, who monitored their own exposure constantly. Someone who had rehearsed escape long before it was needed. Pressure mounted from above. Resources were being spent. Time was being spent. The question came, unspoken but heavy, how long before this either breaks or gets buried again? Detectives argued for patience, for precision. They had come too far to rush now. But patience is a luxury in systems built on metrics and outcomes. A new angle emerged from an unexpected place. A retired detective, reviewing old cases for a memoir he would never finish, recognized a detail that made his pulse quicken. The missing shoe. He had seen it before, not in this case, but in another, years earlier, dismissed as coincidence. The details were different. The victims unrelated. But the symbolism felt too specific to ignore. He brought it forward reluctantly, aware of how dangerous pattern hunting could be. The case he referenced was never solved either. The similarities weren't enough to link officially, but enough to suggest a signature, a habit, something ritualistic. The idea was unsettling. Ritual implies meaning. Meaning implies intent that goes beyond convenience or panic. The team debated it fiercely. Some rejected the idea outright, unwilling to drift into profiling built on intuition rather than evidence. Others saw it as the missing psychological layer, the why beneath the how. If the alias had escalated from fraud to violence, perhaps something had shifted internally, a need not just to get away, but to mark the act. Meanwhile, the family endured the longest silence yet. Updates slowed, not because nothing was happening, but because everything was. Investigators knew better than to share fragile progress, and the family knew better than to push too hard. They had learned to read pauses, to hear meaning in what wasn't said. The weight of almost, the exhaustion of waiting, pressed down harder than ever. Late one night, an analyst noticed a discrepancy that had been hiding in plain sight for nearly a decade. A timestamp. One that didn't align. It was small, easily dismissed as a clerical error, but it appeared in two separate systems that should never have disagreed. One log suggested the victim was already home. Another suggested they weren't. Both couldn't be true. Or both were partially wrong. Digging deeper revealed the possibility that the official time of death was off. Not by hours. By minutes. Enough to shift the entire sequence of events. Enough to place someone in the apartment at a moment they had always claimed to be elsewhere. The revelation sent a jolt through the case. Timelines were redrawn. Alibis rechecked. The board filled with arrows pointing in new directions. One alibi, long considered solid, began to crumble under this new light. A witness had placed themselves at a location that now conflicted with the adjusted timeline. The discrepancy wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. But it was enough to reopen a door everyone thought had closed years ago. The witness was brought back in. Older now. Tired. Less certain. The questions were gentle at first, then sharper. Memory faltered. Details shifted. Finally, the witness admitted they weren't as sure as they had once been. That night blurred with others. The certainty had come later, shaped by repetition and relief. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even an accusation. But it was movement. As the 9th year drew toward its end, the case felt closer to resolution than it ever had, and more unstable because of it. Pieces were aligning, but alignment can create stress fractures. Everyone involved sensed it. The alias sensed it. The city, indifferent as ever, continued to hum around the quiet intensity building beneath its surface. Somewhere, the truth was tightening, compressing under the weight of scrutiny, waiting for the moment when it could no longer hold its shape. And when it broke, investigators knew, it wouldn't do so gently. The 10th year arrived like a held breath finally starting to burn, a moment when endurance turned into urgency and patience began to feel indistinguishable from risk. The recalibrated timeline changed everything. What once seemed settled was now unstable, and instability was dangerous, because it exposed seams the case had spent years hiding. Detectives moved carefully, knowing that one misstep could send the entire structure collapsing back into silence. The witness whose alibi had begun to fray was no longer peripheral. Their name moved closer to the center of the board, not as a suspect, but as a pressure point. Re-interviews followed, spaced deliberately, designed to exhaust rehearsed certainty without triggering panic. Each session peeled away a layer of confidence. The witness didn't contradict themselves outright. Instead, they hesitated. Paused. Asked for questions to be repeated. These were small tells, but in a case built on fragments, they mattered. What emerged wasn't a confession, but something more corrosive: doubt. The witness admitted they had reconstructed that night from assumptions, from what they believed must have happened rather than what they remembered seeing. Their timeline, once delivered with absolute conviction, now felt like a story built to survive scrutiny, not a memory rooted in fact. It didn't place them at the scene. But it did remove the certainty that had protected others. That removal opened space, and into that space stepped the alias again, sharper now, closer than ever. Investigators aligned the adjusted timeline, with known movements tied to the alias's identities, and the overlap was no longer abstract. It was specific. Streets. Minutes. Opportunities. The city's randomness had narrowed into a corridor, and the alias fit inside it too cleanly to ignore. A covert strategy took shape, one that avoided direct confrontation. Instead of pressing the alias about the murder, detectives let pressure build elsewhere. Financial irregularities were flagged. Old fraud cases resurfaced. Associates were questioned about unrelated matters. The goal wasn't arrest. It was disruption. To make the alias uncomfortable enough to make a mistake. The mistake came quietly. A phone powered on when it shouldn't have. Just long enough to register. Just long enough to place the alias within blocks of the old apartment on the anniversary of the murder. It could have been coincidence. It could have been sentiment. Or it could have been something darker, a need to revisit a moment that had defined everything since. Whatever the reason, it was the first unambiguous tether between the alias and the crime's geography. Surveillance tightened. Movements were logged with obsessive precision. Every deviation noted. Every pause questioned. The alias became smaller, more contained, their world shrinking under the weight of attention they could no longer fully evade. And yet, there was still no smoking gun. No weapon. No confession. No witness willing to say the words out loud. Inside the precinct, the mood shifted from anticipation to strain. 10 years is a long time to carry a case, longer still to feel it approaching a resolution that refuses to materialize. Prosecutors demanded clarity. How would this end? An arrest without certainty was unacceptable. Letting it drift again felt unbearable. The family was brought in for a rare, closed-door update. They listened without interruption, absorbing details they had waited a decade to hear. There was progress, investigators said. Real progress. But also risk. The truth, when it came, might not arrive neatly. It might fracture relationships. It might implicate people they thought they understood. The family nodded. At this point, they wanted truth more than comfort. Another piece slid into place unexpectedly. The partial note found years earlier, the one dismissed as trash, was reanalyzed linguistically. Not for handwriting, but for structure. The phrasing matched templates used in certain illicit exchanges, language designed to sound meaningless if intercepted. When cross-referenced with messages recovered from the alias's later activities, the resemblance was unsettling. It suggested continuity. Habit. A way of communicating that had survived across years and crimes. This connection was circumstantial, but it was cumulative. One coincidence could be dismissed. 10 could not. The case was no longer about any single piece of evidence. It was about convergence. Every thread pulled in the same direction, tightening into something that felt inevitable. And yet, inevitability is not proof. The missing shoe returned one last time, now understood not as a random artifact, but as a consequence. If the adjusted timeline was correct, the victim had not arrived home alone. The confrontation had begun earlier, spilled into the apartment, and ended quickly. The shoe wasn't taken. It was lost. A small, human detail in a crime defined by control. That interpretation stripped away any lingering notion of ritual. This wasn't symbolism. It was logistics. As the 10th year edged toward its close, detectives faced a choice they had been postponing for months. Push forward and risk everything. Or hold back, waiting for the one piece that might never come. The alias continued to move, cautiously now, as if sensing the walls tightening. Silence pressed in from all sides, thick and heavy, the kind that precedes either collapse or confession. The case stood at its most fragile point, balanced between revelation and disappearance, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just the story of one night in 2004, but a decade of waiting, watching, and refusing to let the truth slip away again. The 11th year began without ceremony, no press release, no visible shift, just a quiet understanding among investigators that time had stopped being neutral. Every day forward either sharpened the case, or dulled it forever. The alias sensed this too. Caution hardened into paranoia. Movements became erratic, patterns deliberately broken, as if randomness itself could function as camouflage. What changed everything wasn't a breakthrough. It was a failure. A routine surveillance handoff went wrong. A vehicle was spotted where it shouldn't have been, its presence lingering half a second too long. Enough to be noticed. Enough to be remembered. Within hours, the alias altered course, phones discarded, routes abandoned, contacts suddenly unreachable. The message was clear, they knew. For the task force, this was both disaster and confirmation. Innocent people don't vanish when watched. They complain. They lawyer up. They don't erase themselves. The response was immediate but restrained. No arrests. No warrants yet. Instead, investigators pivoted inward, reconstructing everything the alias might believe the police knew. The goal was psychological containment. If the alias thought the net was incomplete, they might try to outrun it. If they believed it was nearly closed, they might slip, and people slip when they rush. Pressure was applied indirectly. A former associate was arrested on an unrelated charge, a minor offense inflated just enough to warrant interrogation. The room was wired. The questions were casual. The name of the alias never spoken. But the associate volunteered it anyway, unprompted, as if trying to push the weight elsewhere. That was the first crack that mattered. The associate didn't describe a murder. They described a favor. A ride. A night when someone needed help cleaning up a situation. At the time, they said, it didn't feel criminal, just messy. People made bad decisions. Apartments got trashed. Nobody talked about blood. Nobody said the word dead. But they remembered the shoe. They remembered laughing about it later, an offhand joke about how someone must have left in a hurry. It had seemed harmless then. Now, under fluorescent lights, it felt obscene. The associate stopped talking after that. Asked for a lawyer. But it was too late. The detail aligned perfectly with evidence the public had never known. That alignment unlocked warrants that had been sitting unsigned for years. Digital forensics tore through seized devices with a patience born of obsession. Deleted messages surfaced in fragments, enough to establish tone if not content. Fear. Urgency. Control. One message, time-stamped within an hour of the estimated time of death, stood out, not for what it said, but for what it asked. Is it done? The reply was gone. But the question didn't need an answer. Confrontation came days later, not in an interrogation room, but in a quiet office with blinds half drawn. The alias was brought in under pretense, told this was about financial discrepancies. They sat calmly, almost bored, until a photograph slid across the table. The shoe. Not the original, too degraded, but a high-resolution reconstruction, paired with the associate statement, the adjusted timeline, the phone ping, the message fragment. No accusations. Just accumulation. Piece after piece placed carefully, relentlessly, until the table felt crowded with inevitability. The alias didn't deny it. Not directly. They leaned back, exhaled, and said something that froze the room. You can't prove intent. It wasn't a confession. But it wasn't innocence either. What followed was silence, long and deliberate. The kind used to regain control. Prosecutors waited it out. Detectives watched for the smallest tells, the tightening jaw, the flicker of calculation. The alias asked for water. Asked how long this would take. Asked what would happen if they cooperated. That was the moment the case crossed its point of no return. By the end of the 11th year, charges were drafted, arguments sharpened, risks weighed with surgical precision. Nothing about this would be easy. The defense would dismantle timelines, attack memory, weaponize doubt. But for the first time since the night everything ended, the truth had a voice, and it was no longer whispering. Outside the building, the city moved on, unaware that a story it had forgotten was about to demand attention again. Not as rumor. Not as speculation. But as a reckoning. The 12th year didn't begin with sirens or headlines. It began with paper. Stacks of it. Affidavits, transcripts, timelines rebuilt down to the minute. The case had survived on intuition for a decade, now it had to withstand law. Every sentence mattered. Every comma could tilt a verdict. Prosecutors moved slowly, deliberately, aware that momentum was a double-edged weapon. Push too fast and the defense would scream coercion. Move too slow and the suspect might vanish again, legally this time, buried behind motions and delays. So they advanced inch by inch, letting procedure do what force never could. The victim's name returned to official documents, no longer followed by the word unsolved, but by phrases like probable cause and material witness. To the family, those words landed with strange weight. Relief, yes, but also fear. Closure was no longer abstract. It was approaching, and it might not look the way they'd imagined for years. Grand jury testimony began behind closed doors. No cameras. No commentary. Just voices in a room, recounting nights they'd tried to forget. Witnesses aged visibly between statements, their memories brittle but intact enough to cut. Some cried. Some didn't. One laughed nervously while describing a scream they claimed they thought was a joke at the time. Jurors listened, stone-faced, absorbing a narrative stitched together from fragments. They saw the shoe. They heard about the message. They learned about the alias, the flight, the carefully constructed second life. And slowly, inevitably, a picture emerged, not of a monster, but of a person who made one irreversible decision and spent years running from its echo. The indictment came sealed. When the arrest finally happened, it was quiet. No chase. No resistance. Just handcuffs clicking shut in a hallway that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet. The alias didn't look shocked. They looked tired. As if this outcome had been rehearsed internally 1,000 times, always ending the same way. News broke within hours. Headlines screamed what they could finally confirm, twisting years of silence into a single explosive sentence. The city reacted in waves, first disbelief, then recognition, then anger. People remembered where they'd been when the murder first made the news. They remembered the grainy photos, the unanswered questions. Now they had a face again. A name. Someone to project all that unresolved emotion onto. But the case wasn't over. Not even close. Pre-trial hearings became battlegrounds. Evidence was challenged aggressively. The defense attacked chain of custody, questioned witness credibility, argued contamination, coincidence, narrative bias. They painted the investigation as desperate, a department so hungry for resolution it saw patterns where none existed. And sometimes, their arguments landed. A key piece of physical evidence was ruled inadmissible due to procedural oversight years earlier. A witness recanted part of their statement, claiming pressure, confusion, fatigue. The prosecution adjusted, recalibrated, tightened its grip on what remained. What remained was still strong, but no longer overwhelming. Behind the scenes, negotiations began. Quiet conversations in quiet rooms. The possibility of a plea surfaced, then vanished, then returned. The alias wanted guarantees. The state wanted admissions. Neither trusted the other enough to blink first. In the middle of it all sat the truth, unchanged, unmoved by strategy or spin. A life ended in a moment of violence. Another life warped by the aftermath. And a city that had lived with the absence of answers for so long it had learned to stop asking. As the 12th year closed, a trial date loomed, uncertain and heavy. Nothing was resolved. Nothing felt finished. The case that refused to die had finally stood up in court, but whether it would walk out with justice or collapse under its own weight remained an open question. And somewhere, beneath the noise of legal maneuvering and public outrage, the original silence still waited. The courtroom felt smaller than anyone expected. Not physically, its ceilings were high, its walls lined with dark wood polished by decades of precedent, but emotionally. Every breath seemed amplified. Every shuffle of paper sounded like intrusion. This was the room where the story would be forced to choose a shape, where ambiguity would be tolerated only if it could be argued convincingly. Jury selection stretched on for days. Potential jurors spoke about fear, about bias, about memories of the original headlines that still clung to them like static. Some were dismissed because they remembered too much. Others because they remembered nothing at all. The final 12 took their seats carrying a strange burden. They would be asked to decide not just what happened, but what mattered after all this time. Opening statements avoided drama. No grandstanding. No raised voices. The prosecution spoke plainly, almost cautiously, as if aware that spectacle would only cheapen what they were about to unfold. This was not a mystery anymore, they said. It was a sequence. Actions, reactions, consequences. The defense countered with a single theme and returned to it relentlessly: doubt. Not innocence. Not alternative suspects. Just doubt. Reasonable. Persistent. Fatal. The first witnesses reintroduced the night itself. The apartment. The sounds through the walls. The timeline reconstructed from fragments of memory and digital residue. Each detail arrived stripped of flourish, but together they built pressure. Jurors leaned forward. Pens paused mid-air. The story was beginning to breathe again. Then came the evidence that had survived every challenge. The shoe. Displayed under sterile lighting, it looked smaller than expected. Almost ordinary. But its presence in that room carried weight beyond its size. An object without motive, without intention, yet impossible to explain away. The prosecution let it sit in silence for a moment too long, forcing the jurors to confront the same question investigators had wrestled with for years. How does something like this get left behind unless someone is running from something they cannot face? Expert testimony followed, careful and restrained. No certainty where certainty could not be claimed. Probabilities. Likelihoods. Patterns consistent with struggle, with haste, with panic. The defense seized on every qualifier, every possible, and cannot rule out, hammering home the idea that uncertainty was not weakness, it was exoneration. But the case didn't hinge on science alone. When the associate took the stand, the air shifted. This wasn't expertise. This was proximity. A person who had been there, adjacent to the aftermath, carrying guilt that had fermented into something sour over time. Their voice wavered. They contradicted themselves once, corrected it, apologized. The defense pounced, framing the testimony as self-serving, a bargain dressed up as conscience. Still, some details refused to bend. The joke about the shoe. The late-night call. The request for help that didn't sound like help at all. Jurors noticed. They always do. Then came the message fragment. Projected onto a screen, stripped of context, it looked almost trivial. 4 words. No names. No violence. Just a question. But timing is everything. The prosecution walked the jury through it slowly, aligning the timestamp with the last confirmed sighting of the victim, with the phone's movement, with the sudden silence that followed. The implication was clear without being spoken. Is it done? The defense argued coincidence. Misinterpretation. 1,000 benign explanations. But none fit cleanly. Each required assumptions layered on top of assumptions, stories built to counter a story that already existed. The most anticipated moment never came. The defendant did not testify. Some jurors expected it. Some feared it. When the defense rested without calling them to the stand, the courtroom exhaled collectively. Silence filled the gap where a voice might have been. The prosecution didn't comment. They didn't need to. Absence has a way of speaking for itself. Closing arguments were sharp, surgical. No theatrics. Just lines drawn from point to point, urging the jury to see not isolated doubts, but an unbroken chain. The defense responded by dismantling that chain link by link, insisting that age, memory, and bias had warped perception beyond repair. When deliberations began, the city waited. Hours passed. Then days. Speculation flooded every corner, online forums, talk radio, late-night conversations between strangers who suddenly remembered why this case had haunted them. Some were convinced justice was inevitable. Others braced for disappointment, certain that time had eroded too much, that the past had slipped beyond reach. Inside the jury room, voices rose and fell. Diagrams were drawn. Timelines argued over. One juror fixated on the shoe. Another couldn't get past the message. A third kept returning to the associate's laugh, the wrongness of it, the way it echoed in their head. Consensus came slowly. Painfully. When the bailiff finally knocked, the courtroom snapped to attention. The defendant stood. The family held hands. The city held its breath. But the verdict, when read, did not deliver release. It delivered something else entirely. A fracture. A decision that answered one question while leaving another open. A conclusion that satisfied the law, but not the ache beneath it. Some wept. Some stared straight ahead. The defendant showed no expression at all. Outside, cameras waited, hungry for a word that could summarize years of silence. None came. Because what unfolded inside that courtroom did not end the story. It reshaped it. And as the 13th year drew to a close, one truth remained untouched: even when a case is decided, its shadow doesn't disappear. It lingers. In unanswered questions. In half-believed certainty. In the quiet spaces where doubt learns how to survive. The verdict fractured the room, but it didn't empty it. People stayed seated long after the judge exited, as if standing too soon might make the outcome real. There was no single reaction, no unified response that could be packaged into a headline clean enough to satisfy the waiting cameras. Justice, when filtered through time, rarely lands with clarity. It lands with weight. Outside, microphones were raised. Questions fired. Was this closure? Was this justice? Was this the end? No one answered directly, because no one could. The family spoke first, voices measured, expressions fixed somewhere between relief and grief. They thanked the investigators. They thanked the jury. They did not thank the system. Not explicitly. They didn't need to. The defendant was led away without ceremony. No outburst. No collapse. Just the quiet shuffle of someone whose future had narrowed suddenly and permanently. Reporters noted the lack of emotion, mistaking it for indifference. Those who had studied the case knew better. Some silences are rehearsed. Some are survival. Appeals were filed almost immediately. Procedural challenges. Claims of prejudice. Arguments that the verdict was the product of narrative, not fact. The legal machinery resumed its slow churn, indifferent to fatigue, immune to sentiment. For the public, this felt like an aftershock. For the families, it felt like the ground refusing to settle. In the weeks that followed, the city tried to move on. News cycles shifted. New crimes took the spotlight. But the case lingered in conversation, resurfacing in moments of quiet, on subway platforms, in bars near the courthouse, in late-night searches that led people back to archived articles and grainy photos they thought they'd forgotten. Something else lingered too. A detail that hadn't made it into the verdict. During deliberations, one juror had raised a question that never found its way into the courtroom record. It concerned a gap, small, almost negligible, in the timeline presented by both sides. 10 minutes. Unaccounted for. Too short to prove anything. Too long to ignore entirely. The jury debated it, then moved past it, guided by instruction and precedent. But the question didn't disappear. It surfaced again when a retired detective gave an interview months later, speaking off the record, his voice distorted, his words chosen carefully. He mentioned that there had always been something off about that window of time. A neighbor who couldn't be placed. A camera that had glitched. A phone that stopped pinging, then resumed miles away without explanation. None of it changed the verdict. But it complicated it. Online, theories reignited. Not the wild kind, but the meticulous ones. Timelines annotated. Maps redrawn. Old witness statements reread with fresh skepticism. Some argued the defendant had been framed by circumstance and pressure. Others believed the conviction was overdue but incomplete, that someone else had been there too, someone whose name never made it into court. The prosecution dismissed it all publicly. Privately, a few admitted the case still bothered them. Not because they doubted the outcome, but because certainty had never fully arrived. It rarely does in cases like this. Truth, when filtered through years of decay, tends to arrive in pieces, never whole. The victim's apartment was renovated. New tenants. The victim's apartment was renovated. New tenants moved in, unaware of the history sealed behind fresh paint and modern fixtures. The floors no longer creaked the same way. The walls no longer echoed with the past. But buildings remember, even when people don't. Some nights, neighbors reported noises they couldn't explain, nothing dramatic, nothing that made the news. Just sounds that made them pause, listen, and then shake their heads as if embarrassed by their own imagination. Officially, the case was closed. Files were archived. Evidence sealed. The name of the defendant entered databases alongside a verdict that would follow them forever. To the system, this was resolution. To the city, it was something closer to exhaustion. A long-held breath released not in relief, but resignation. And yet, closure refused to settle. The unanswered questions didn't scream. They whispered. They lived in that 10-minute gap no one could fill. In the neighbor who never testified. In the camera that failed at the wrong moment. In the phone that went silent, then spoke again from somewhere it shouldn't have been. Small things. Inconvenient things. The kind that don't overturn verdicts, but don't disappear either. Years passed. The family marked anniversaries more quietly now. Fewer interviews. Fewer statements. They had learned that grief doesn't end, it just changes shape. Sometimes it looked like acceptance. Sometimes it looked like anger. Most days, it looked like silence. The defendant appealed once. Then again. Each time denied. Each time the language colder, more procedural, as if repetition alone could drain meaning from the act. Eventually, even the appeals stopped. Not because hope vanished, but because it hardened into something private. One winter, a box surfaced in an evidence storage audit. Misfiled. Forgotten. Inside were photographs never entered into trial, dismissed years earlier as redundant. Most showed nothing of value. One showed a reflection in a darkened window, distorted, incomplete, possibly meaningless. Possibly not. By the time anyone noticed, it was too late. The statute on further inquiry had expired. The case could no longer be reopened without cause strong enough to move mountains. And reflections, no matter how unsettling, don't move mountains. So the box was resealed. Logged. Returned to darkness. The city changed. Neighborhoods shifted. People who had followed the case from the beginning grew older, told the story to newcomers as something that had happened before they arrived. Details blurred. Names softened. But the feeling remained, that something about it never quite fit. Late at night, when the noise of the city thinned, radio hosts still referenced it in passing. True crime podcasts dissected it with reverence and restraint. Listeners argued over guilt and doubt, certainty and coincidence, each convinced they saw what others had missed. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't. That's the cruelty of cases like this. They don't end. They fade. They retreat into the background, resurfacing when the world grows quiet enough to hear them again. They remind us that truth isn't always loud, and justice isn't always complete. Somewhere in New York, a memory still wakes someone up at night. Somewhere, a detail remains unspoken, because it no longer has a place to land. And somewhere between what was proven and what was felt, the story continues to exist, unresolved, unsettled, waiting. Not for a verdict, but for peace that may never come.